Is it? The microphone is on. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Yaki Silia. I'm the head of the African Futures and Innovation Program at the Institute for Security Studies. And welcome to our seminar this morning with the title, Can Africa Adapt to Future Impacts of Climate Change? We have two speakers, Lily Wellborn, who's a researcher at the African Futures and Innovation Program. Lily studied in Denver, did her master's in international studies and security at Denver University. As many of you know, we collaborate with Denver University in our long-term forecasting work, and joined the ISS last year. And our respondent is Dr. Paul Simon Handy, who's a senior research fellow at the Institute. Paul has been with the Institute since 2007 and has worked across various broad issues on security in Africa, with a particular focus on Central and West Africa. I'd like particularly to welcome our online audience. The seminar is broadcast through the ISS Africa TV and will afterwards also be available on YouTube. We conclude the broadcast section at the end of the formal presentations. So all of what we are saying until then is on the record. Afterwards, the section, the Q&A section, is we will say goodbye to our online audience, and we will proceed with that on standard sort of Chatham House rules. I'd like to particularly thank the supporters of the Institute. This seminar is funded by the Hans Heidel Foundation, as well as CEDA, the Swedish International Development Agency. And the ISS is also grateful for the support from the members from the ISS Partnership Forum, the Hans Heidel Foundation, the European Union, and the governments of Australia, Canada, Denmark, Finland, Ireland, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, and the United States. There can be few things more important than the impact of climate change. Recently, Lily and I were both in Dakar. We are doing a study on the long-term future of the Sahel, which is the region that is the most dramatically impacted with climate change. And the impacts and the forecasts that we see are really quite frightening. So I think the work that we are going to listen to today complements the other long-term forecasting work that the African Futures and Innovation Program has done on poverty and on conflict and a variety of other factors, including the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, of which we have done a significant amount of work. So I'm going to ask Lily to speak first for, I think, 20 to 30 minutes, and then after that, Paul will respond. And after that, we will say goodbye to our online audience and then proceed with questions and discussions. So Lily, if you can speak to us on this most interesting subject.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm excited to share some of this research that I've been working on for several months now, but this is obviously a highly technical and scientific topic. I think now that I've finished writing a report on climate change, I can feel ready to write another report on climate change that would be more in-depth and cover, some of the more technical elements of how climate change is going to impact how we all live and work on this planet. But this work has represented kind of an initial effort to grapple with what are the realities of climate change, what are the facts out there, and how are people in this continent and in other regions that are disproportionately impacted by the climates of climate change, by the impacts of climate change, what are the best ways to adapt? And as most people here are probably aware, that requires a delicate balance of inclusive economic development while also effectively managing the natural resources that we do still have. So the reality of climate change and its physical science basis has been known for decades. This is not new science, though our understanding of it improves every year. There's an overwhelming scientific consensus that human activity, primarily the burning of fossil fuels and the consequent release of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, has been the primary driver of all global warming since the Industrial Revolution, and has been responsible for 100% of global warming since the 1970s. And the previous 3 decades have seen successively hotter temperatures that have been seen in previous centuries. As I said, this is caused by the release of greenhouse gases, the most powerful of which is carbon dioxide, and the result is that the Earth atmosphere system is warming. This is triggering the melting of our tundra, of the Antarctic ice, and most of the carbon dioxide is absorbed by oceans, actually, but the consequent rise in surface temperatures also is very well measured, and scientists are all very alarmed, and it seems only few politicians are willing to listen to these scientific findings. So the current concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is unprecedented over the past few million years, and humans are releasing it at a rate 14,000 times faster than has been seen in the natural world for millions of years. The result is that the climate has warmed about 1 degree Celsius since the Industrial Revolution, and it's warming faster than scientists had previously predicted. And the IPCC recently came out with a special report. As some people here probably know, the IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's the UN body responsible for analyzing and collecting data on the rate of climate change and its social and economic impacts. So it's like they recently established that the climate will probably reach 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels as early as 2030 and definitely by 2050. So even if all emissions of greenhouse gases were to be stopped now due to past emissions and inertia in the climate system, the climate change impacts will continue to worsen, inevitably through mid-century. Climate change is an inherently global phenomenon. No society is immune to its impacts. But regions that are at the mid-latitudes and that have populations living at low levels of development, and in countries with states that have poor capacity, are disproportionately vulnerable and bear the brunt of these impacts. So Africa now contributes around 4% of global carbon dioxide emissions. That results in an incredibly low per capita emissions rate, especially compared to regions like North America and Europe. However, Africa is home to half of the world's extremely poor population and about half of the global population living without access to safe water, which throughout this presentation I'll refer to as improved water. So some of the impacts of climate change that we're most aware of range from droughts to increased flooding from rising sea levels and more extreme and erratic rainfall events, heat waves, decreased agricultural productivity and the harmed productivity of fisheries. All of these impacts lead to threatened food and water security. Those are the main impacts on people on the African continent, but also elsewhere, and this is not to mention, of course, the impact on biodiversity and coral bleaching, etc. So the goal of my research has been to do a kind of vulnerability assessment. I have done this by combining the forecasts that the International Futures Model presents, which I'll talk about in a moment. That's the integrated assessment model that we use at AFI, the African Futures and Innovation Program, with the existing climate scenarios that have been presented by the climate research community. So I've attempted to kind of combine these more social and economic projections with physical climate projections to identify where people are most vulnerable and how this is likely to change in the coming decades. Some of these socio-economic projections also help us to kind of gauge capacity to adapt and vulnerability to climate change. And so the overarching goal and the purpose of this report is to say, how is Africa's adaptive capacity likely to change in the coming decades, and what do the patterns look like, and what can be done to improve that? A key element of this is the strategies of mitigation and adaptation. These are terms we're all familiar with. They're generally recognized as the two options that societies have when confronting inevitable climate change impacts. As we know, mitigation efforts such as the Paris Agreement to limit warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, which is, by the way, considered the threshold beyond which the climate will not be suitable for humans to inhabit. That's a mitigation effort. We can present a lot of questions as to its efficacy, granted that it's a non-binding treaty, but that's a discussion for another day. That's a mitigation attempt. It seeks to reduce the magnitude or rate of climate change over the long term, and most of the benefits of mitigation efforts will emerge in the latter half of the century. Sorry, I keep hitting that. Conversely, adaptation efforts seek to reduce the damage caused by these inevitable impacts. Tanzania recently built a long stretch of seawalls. This represents a hard infrastructure and a hard adaptation effort to physically hold back the impacts of climate change, in that case rising sea levels and more intense storms. So ideally, mitigation and adaptation efforts are most effective when implemented together. The distinction between them is somewhat superficial, as some mitigation efforts can have immediate benefits while adaptation efforts can also have longer term. So it's important to keep in mind that these two strategies are somewhat fluid, and both are necessary in order to, preserve sustainable development over the long term. But in this case, I focused primarily on adaptive capacity, granted the really low contribution of the African continent to greenhouse gas emissions, and in turn the magnitude and rate of climate change. So I've mentioned that long-term scenario planning is a central feature of climate change research. Here at the African Futures and Innovation Program, we use the International Futures Model, as I mentioned, which I'll describe in a moment. That's an integrated assessment model that has a strong focus on human development. Conversely, climate change research has focused on not only societal developments over the coming decades, but also climate trajectories with more technical climate models and potential policy futures. And I'll describe those in a moment, but I've kind of drawn the best from our research, which is focused on human development, and the climate research, which models potential impacts of climate change and is way over my head. So the International Futures Model is a modeling platform that helps us to understand near to long-term structural changes in countries, regions, and globally. It works across multiple interacting issue areas to help us understand how they interact to influence development in the coming decades. It also has a feature where you can introduce alternative scenarios. So you can design alternative scenarios where you can test the benefits and trade-offs of certain policy assumptions or policy interventions. Or we can bring in alternative scenarios that have been developed outside of the international futures community, and I'll get more to that in a moment. But that's a critical element of the international futures model that allows us to kind of jump across disciplines and create integrated analyses. So there are three essential questions that the international futures model helps us to explore in a systematic way. First, because it is a massive data repository containing over 4,000 variables back to the year 1960 where data is available, helps us to explore the past and how we've gotten to where we are. What are the trends in in the data and in historical developments that have led to the current state of affairs. Second, it helps us to understand how these systems are interacting over time. And based on how they're interacting in those trends, where do we think we're going? This is called the current path forecast, or the base case. This current path forecast, which is what my report is based on, assumes an essential continuation of current trends and also assumes that there will be no major environmental shocks or policy shocks or conflicts, etc. And the scenario feature that I mentioned earlier helps us to shape the future in our reports and help us to identify the policy interventions that can help us get there. And these, by helping users to understand how these three questions interact and how we may address them, it helps to frame uncertainty around the future by identifying the structural trends, how we've gotten to where we are today, and where are the key points that can make a difference regarding future developments. And the model is completely open source. It's, as Yaki previously mentioned, it's based at the University of Denver in Colorado. All documentation is available, as is the coding, and you can download it for free at this website. And please reach out to me if you have any questions on how to access the model or how to use it. I mentioned that the International Futures Model contains data and algorithms to forecast relationships across various submodules, at the heart of which are demographics. Like all of our other data, most of this is derived from international standardized sources of data, such as the UNPD, or the UN Population Division in this case. And then we have an economics module, education, health, infrastructure, agriculture, energy, environment, technology, governance, finance, and international politics. So at the top in blue, we have the social systems and IFs. In the middle in maroon, we have the human systems. And in the bottom in green, we have the natural or physical systems. And all of these are interconnected. So a change in one will affect change across all of the others. So I had previously mentioned the scenario framework for climate research. This has been created with the IPCC essentially leading this research, but the modeling community from around the world has contributed to the creation of social, climate, and policy scenarios that help us to understand where we think we're going. The key, or at the heart of these climate scenarios, are the shared socioeconomic pathways, or the SSPs. So the SSPs are essentially global pathways of societal development, and each is defined by the level of challenges it presents to adapting or mitigating to climate change. And so they are designed, they have been in a way reverse engineered to say, these are the characteristics of a societal scenario that would make it easier to adapt to climate change or harder to mitigate climate change. So as you can see on the left, on the y-axis, is the socioeconomic challenges to mitigation. So the higher up on the left, it shows the higher the challenges to mitigation. And up at that left corner is SSP 5. And in this scenario, the key features are a heavy dependence on fossil fuels, a lack of respect for environmental boundaries or cognizance of the carrying capacity of the planet. So this is kind of how we're seeing our world unfolding today. There's an unwillingness and a lot of bureaucratic inertia and inefficacy at intergovernmental governing institutions to act on mitigating climate change. This is what we're seeing today. But you'll see, since it's far to the left here on the bottom, on the x-axis, are socioeconomic challenges for adaptation. So in that scenario, we may, in SSP5, which is characterized by high challenges to mitigation, it may be easier to adapt to climate change in that scenario. They don't necessarily have to co-vary. And this means that there would be higher levels of human capital, which means essentially increased investments in education, healthcare, basic infrastructure. These are the investments that lead to improved levels of development that make it easier to adapt to climate change. You see at the bottom left SSP1. This is the ideal scenario. It's titled Sustainability. This is a scenario in which everything goes right. This is not currently where the world is heading today, but it's still a future that can be achieved. That's where there is rapid economic growth, but there is increased investment and attention towards renewable sources of energy. There are lowered population growth rates, a controversial topic, but the relationship between population size and the rate of growth is immensely important to climate change and environmental degradation. So this is the scenario. SSP1 is the scenario that I compare against the current path that I previously mentioned from the International Futures Model. Meanwhile, SSP2 is kind of a middle-of-the-road scenario. It's kind of the climate community's equivalent of our current path. SSP3 is where there are high challenges to adapting to and mitigating climate change. So there's both low human development, increased inequality, low rates of technological progress, and also high dependence on fossil fuels. And SSP4, of course, is where there are high challenges for adaptation but low challenges to mitigation. So I don't cover all of these in my research. This just kind of sets the foundation of the logic behind this framework. And SSP1 is really the only scenario that I've focused on in my report as being the ideal scenario, and I've tried to identify how we can get there. Another element of the scenario framework for climate research is the representative concentration pathways. Learning about this was tough. There are lots of technical terms like levels of radiative forcing, things that I will only be able to wrap my head around to a degree, but these representative concentration pathways, or the RCPs, essentially show what different levels of greenhouse gas emissions will result in with regards to global warming in the future. So they represent different climate scenarios, and they interact with the SSPs in complicated ways, and there's a lot of literature on this that's really helpful. So if you are interested and would like some resources, let me know. So as you can see in this graph, there's global warming on the far left, and here the lines, the red, the yellow, the blue, and the gray lines represent the different RCPs. So RCP 1.9 is the lowest climate scenario. That's not represented on the graph because the IPCC essentially created it following the Paris Agreement, because that would be a scenario in which warming is limited to 1.5 degrees, and recent reports have shown that it's less. It's about the chances of the world achieving limiting warming to 1.5 degrees is about 1 in 20. It's just not. It's not going to happen. The next is RCP 2.6, the second lowest emissions scenario. Above that 4.5, and then 6.0, and then 8.5. So it's not so much the exact numbers here that matter, but the trajectories that they show. So on a business as usual path in which global carbon emissions continue unmitigated, which is here, we can see that global warming will reach above 5 degrees of warming since 1990 by the end of the century. And that's nearly an apocalyptic scenario. And sorry if that's confusing, it's actually 4 degrees C relative to pre-industrial levels, which is the more standard benchmarking method. So scientists and others have been, sounding alarms that's been deafening for decades now, saying reaching that scenario would mean essentially an end to the planet that is habitable by humans and all other life. So that's the path that we're currently on. And so it's kind of the path that we've started assuming in all of our modeling, like we've done in the Sahel, saying, okay, we have to realistically think this is a possible future, and these, what will the impacts look like, etc. You'll see here, up until 2050, all of these lines overlap. That's because, as I said earlier, inertia in the climate system means that warming will essentially be the same across all of these scenarios for the next few decades. And that also, of course, means that the impacts of climate change that I mentioned earlier, which relate to droughts and heat waves and ocean acidification, and perhaps more importantly in the intensity of natural disasters, will worsen until 2050, regardless of what's done now. However, beyond 2050, the magnitude of these impacts will determine the extent to which world leaders now can decide whether to adopt a carbon tax. That's what many researchers have identified as essentially the only solution to reducing carbon dioxide emissions. So these impacts of climate change and the degree of warming vary broadly around the globe. Africa is the hottest continent on the planet and home to the largest hot desert, the Sahara. And in fact, 2/3 of the continent is considered arid. And while the flora and fauna of arid environments vary greatly, they're generally characterized by highly variable and insufficient rainfall and excessive heat. So you can see here, sorry, learning this pointer. You can see here, of course, these are the primarily arid climates that stretch from most of southern Africa, most of eastern Africa, and of course all of northern Africa, with the exception of the Mediterranean climates of the North African coasts. If we stretch down into the Sahel region, which is outlined, as Yaki briefly mentioned, the Sahel is the transitional ecoregion that's semi-arid that essentially borders the southern part of the Sahara Desert. The exact locations of this region are changing as they're defined by the location of the Sahara Desert, which is kind of continuously moving downward. But the Sahel, in addition to Western Africa, is identified as the regions in the world that will experience unprecedented climates earlier than anywhere else in the world. This is due to geophysical elements, but it's also due to the fact that people in these regions really rely heavily on rainfall for agricultural production, and that any more erratic rainfall patterns could be devastating, and they already have been, actually, as we've seen by the level of humanitarian crises and near famines we've seen across the Sahel and also in Eastern Africa. Of course, Central Africa is a bit different. It's blanketed by the rainforests of the Congo Basin. In Central Africa and Eastern Africa, though temperatures are expected to increase as they are across the rest of the continent, rainfall is actually projected to increase. Though, of course, the impacts of this on agricultural activities aren't necessarily positive, given that this will likely come in the form of extreme rainfall events that current levels of development cannot adapt to. Same in West Africa. We've seen this by the devastating impacts of flooding from extreme rainfall in Nigeria, Niger, and elsewhere. So, on the current path, levels of development and state capacity across most of Africa, but predominantly in sub-Saharan Africa, are going to remain low. So development outcomes are improving, but for the next several decades, research shows that it will not be high enough, essentially, for effective capacity to adapt to climate change. This is because low levels of development and generally weak state capacity and the extent to which they vary within and across countries determine the challenges that societies face in adapting to and mitigating climate change. So here I'll show some of our forecasts for proxies for levels of development and state capacity, which I've chosen as extreme poverty, levels of water, or levels of access to improved water, and also revenue, total government revenue as a percent of GDP. So this graph shows the IFS model's current path forecast for extreme poverty. We see on the left that this is represented in millions of people, so this is the absolute number of people living in extreme poverty and not the rate. And on the bottom, we're going from year 2015 to 2050. So we can see here, from here down, this is all African regions. This yellow is Western Africa, green is Southern, maroon is Eastern, and the blue is Central Africa. I haven't included North Africa here because it's nearly not visible when presented on this scale due to how small their population of people is living in extreme poverty. And this is per the World Bank definition of earning $1.90 or less per day. So we see that now Africa is home to about half of the world's population of extremely poor, and that the continent's share of this population is only set to increase through to mid-century. So this is the number of people in the rest of the world living in extreme poverty, and we see it's decreasing, while in Africa it's actually increasing and is going to continue increasing in all of Africa's regions except Northern Africa for several decades. This is a devastating reality, one that, when combined with projections of climate change research, shows that much needs to be done in order to reduce the vulnerability and increase the adaptive capacity of these populations. This is an inherently unfair dynamic. As I've mentioned, Africa and many other parts of the world where most countries are still developing have contributed very little to throwing the climate off balance. And I don't really talk about this in the report much, but a key element of this is highly industrialized countries meeting their promised contributions to increasing the adaptive capacity of the countries that are most at risk. So the large majority, as we can see by this graph, of people who are extremely poor in Africa are living in Western and Eastern Africa. In fact, their combined number of extremely poor people is 310 million people, which is over double the number of extremely poor people in the rest of the continent, which is currently estimated to be around 105 million people. Or 150 million people, sorry. Western Africa currently has the largest population of people who are extremely poor in the continent, and it's also growing faster. And this is not likely to change in the coming decades as represented by this forecast. Currently, Western Africa is home to about 165 million people who are living below the international extreme poverty line. This is growing and is projected to peak only in about 2 decades, around 2040, at 210 million people. And nearly all of this a large majority of this population is located in Nigeria alone. And that's also not set to change. Nigeria, due to its really large and rapidly growing population and poor state capacity, and due to the fact that average incomes aren't rising quickly enough, will continue to be home to the large majority of people living in extreme poverty in the region. Actually, I want to... So if we layer on top of this knowledge what we know about projected climate change impacts, this is extremely alarming and shows that Western Africa, the issues of poverty and around human development and reducing vulnerability is critical in Western Africa. The region faces a wide array of climate change risks due to its climatic diversity. Western Africa is actually the most diverse region in climatic terms in the continent. They face not only droughts and extreme heat waves, but also rising sea levels, and due to large populations of extremely poor, the climate change impacts that are associated with urban poverty. This graph shows the population of people in Africa who are currently living without access to safe water. Poor water infrastructure is particularly concerning in the context of climate change, given that communities who rely upon unimproved sources such as unprotected wells or untreated surface water from ponds or springs are disproportionately vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, which is set to deteriorate the quality and availability of renewable surface and groundwater. As we can see, while in the rest of the world the number of people who don't have a improved source of water for drinking is declining, in Africa it's actually set to stagnate around 300 million people until just before 2030, before declining. This also reflects low levels of state capacity and just an absence of the basic infrastructure necessary for human well-being and human development. The total government revenue as a percentage of GDP is also indicative of poor state capacity across the continent. You'll see in the bottom blue line, Sub-Saharan Africa, around a fifth of GDP is from total government revenue. This is low compared to regions that have countries with higher state capacity, which are shown by the graph. It's also reflected in the high percentage of foreign aid receipts, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, which also account for about a fifth of GDP, which shows that countries across Sub-Saharan Africa are struggling to mobilize the resources they need and implement them effectively to deliver the services needed. And this is also not projected to improve significantly in the coming decades, though modest improvement is projected. How am I on time? Am I over time? Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, SSP1 is kind of the ideal scenario for societal development. It's a scenario in which environmental sustainability and inclusive economic development are prioritized over reckless environmental degradation like we've seen in some highly industrialized countries. It shows a very different future than what we see on the current path, in which state capacity is forecast to remain low and the number of people who are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change is projected to increase. So in this green road scenario, as I mentioned, SSP1 is titled Sustainability. The latter half of that is taking the green road. So in my report, I've referred to it as such. In this scenario, Africa is in a much better position to adapt to the impacts of climate change, and the size of its highly vulnerable population is much smaller. This graph shows the difference in absolute extreme poverty and the extreme poverty rate between the green road scenario and the current path. So here in the dashed lines, we have the poverty rate in the extreme road scenario, in the green road scenario, which falls dramatically, primarily due to inclusive and equitable economic growth. Conversely, on the current path, the poverty rate is projected to remain above 20% even by mid-century. And here on this right axis, we see this is the poverty rate, while on this left axis, we see this is the population in extreme poverty in millions, which is represented by the solid lines. So on the current path, as we've seen, the number of people living in extreme poverty is forecast to grow for the coming decades. but on the Green Road, it actually goes down. And this is a pretty dramatic reduction in extreme poverty, but it is achievable. We have seen it in countries like China.
Thanks, Lily. Paul Simon, are you doing this? Stand over there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lily. Thank you, Yaki, also for inviting me to respond to this. Thanks, Lily, for a really nice report. Gave me a bit of hard time reading it. Actually, interesting time reading it. So it's a nice report. Yesterday evening, and I imagine how much work went into it by you and the whole AFI team. So, great piece. It's also a piece that comes quite timely, together with the IPCC reports that you mentioned, but also while preparing for it, I also stumbled across this report by the UN and the Maplecroft organization, actually on exactly the impact of climate change on cities worldwide, and also particularly African cities. We'll come back to it. So the picture we paint here might look a bit bleak, but actually the conclusion is more optimistic than we think, because at the end of the day, governance matters, and I think that's a glimpse of hope. Mitigation and adaptation are important, as indicated by the Green Road scenario. The role of respondent is often to find controversial issues in a paper and flag them, but I'm afraid I mostly agree actually with many of the conclusions, and of course with the analysis that was done in that report. So do not expect any controversial issues here, but who knows? I will particularly focus in a very short time on two main findings of the report. The first one, I think the major one, around the fact that climate change essentially impacts poor populations, as they are particularly vulnerable to climate hazards, in addition to food insecurity and water scarcity. And I would like to illustrate that point with something that happens in the Sahel, in West Africa and parts of West Africa and the Sahel, and namely is the issue of pastoralism and conflict. I'm a conflict researcher, so excuse me to see the link with conflict. In parts of West Africa and the Sahel, we've seen a slow but steady increase in conflicts involving pastoralists and in general, and that have substantially, I mean, it has not substantially, not massively, but it is gradual, it's increasing in some West African countries and the Sahel, but also in parts of Central Africa, by the way. So these conflicts are primarily driven by, as the report says, by a competition for land, water, and forage. And the main issue is actually also more about how those natural resources are managed and allocated. These conflicts impact national, human, of course, but also regional security, because pastoralism is not just a revenue-generating activity. It is also a century-long cultural practice that is adopted by various communities in the region. This activity cannot be thought without one of its major dimensions, that is the mobility of herders and their animals. We call it in French transhumance. It's cattle migration, and it happens on a seasonal basis between dry and rainy seasons. Due to increased access to vaccine, but also due to climate change, herders are now forced to move further, sometimes across several country borders, and even because of healthier herds, actually, and with ever bigger herds now. They do that in search of greener pastures, and the consequence, and because of the size, the bigger size of these herds, the presence of bandits along their routes and the adversity of some communities, now increasingly herders are armed, sometimes heavily armed, just to protect what for them is not just an economic activity, but also a cultural way of being. So, and the consequence of this is an increase in rural conflict, like we can see in the central and northern parts of Mali, but also at the border between the Central African Republic and Chad. In any case, we see the combined effect of demographic and ecological pressures, climate change, and acute variability and unpredictability in rainfall patterns. These are the main drivers of those very rural conflicts that are also, unfortunately, extremely underreported. So we actually don't know exactly the magnitude of those of the casualties. But there are also an aggravating factor is also the weak government capacity, particularly regarding the management of natural resources. That doesn't help. The problem with those conflicts, as I said, is the fact that they are underreported, among others. The second issue I would like to briefly issue, a flag, is actually that climate change doesn't only impact poor segments of African population, but increasingly also puts some strain into urban centers, actually the places where African growth is happening. So a recent study collectively by the UN in this Mapplecroft organization come to an interesting conclusion according to which even areas where we have the highest growth in Africa are also, the urban centers are increasingly vulnerable to climate change. This could actually mean that the intensification of the strain put on the delivery of services could seriously jeopardize African growth. Damage to property, infrastructure, and assets caused by tropical cyclones and floods are among the obvious impacts. Of course, generally, the damage will be higher in the poorer areas of urban centers, but as we know and as we can see everywhere, floods and cyclones don't distinguish between poor and rich when they happen. So, in conclusion, I will come back to a more optimistic view of all that. As Lily said, getting the basics right is important. This scenario is not just important to mitigate climate change, but also in terms of sustainable development. Governance matters. And I would like to end by pointing out the demographic factor, actually, because as we saw, it seems to be central in not just the impact of climate change, but also in managing a more sustainable development path. We also know that the African demographic story is very unique when compared to demographic development in other parts of the world. But of course, you know, demography and sustainable development is sometimes a bit like a chicken and egg situation where actually we don't know exactly what is the cause and what is the effect. If we look at Asia, the Asian demographic story is quite interesting. Asia without China, because China has a completely different story. 40 years ago, of course, demographic projections about the Asian populations were quite bleak. But we saw that with growing economic development, actually there was the demographic population growth rates actually plateaued at some point. But we also know, and that's the story also that the development studies tell us, that economic development also leads to a decrease in population growth. So there, and I know that Yaki has been quite an advocate of slowing demographic growth to improve economic well-being in Africa. But we actually, although projections of African economic growth are not as optimistic as to the point where they will mitigate the effects of increasingly growing populations, we might look at the Asian story maybe to think a little bit differently. But as we say, governance matters, and that's the most important thing. And the green scenario, the green road scenario, is extremely optimistic. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul Simon. Appreciate those comments. I think at this point, I would like to thank our online audience, and we're going to say goodbye to them, and then continue with our discussions in the seminar room. So thank you very much for attending. And Richard, if you could indicate if we could then carry on with the question and answer session.